This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Stevenson with his own moves. Carrington. North are in front.
Welcome back to North Pod. I'm Jason, and thank you for tuning in after what can only be described as another belting at the hands of Melbourne this time. Things are starting to turn a little ugly, unfortunately. So not a good weekend at the football for anyone who was a North Melbourne fan. If you didn't tune in, probably a good thing for you. But the final score was Melbourne 139 to North Melbourne 49. So a solid 90-point belting. It did look like it was going to be 100 plus there for a minute in the last quarter, but fortunately North were able to kick a couple of goals towards the end and get it back down to two digits, which is a big problem if we're looking at from a positive perspective. That's a bit of an issue. The story of the game, as far as I was concerned, was just that first quarter. The game was done. Quarter time, Melbourne led 50-6. And the game was absolutely cooked by that point. I don't think anyone at the ground thought North Melbourne was going to come back and win from there. There might have been a few people that thought North Melbourne might, become a bit more competitive. But it was not a good performance in that first quarter, and that certainly continued. It just really showed the difference between a developing side in North Melbourne and an elite side in Melbourne. Obviously, Melbourne's won the premiership a couple of years ago, and their side is still, their core group is still the same. They've obviously had a few in and a few out since then, as every side does, but they've still got those really elite players like Gawn and Petrarca and Oliver. So, we just really didn't put up a whimper, to be honest. Just in terms of what Melbourne was able to do, their clearances were to advantage of their players. They were quite effective. They had quite accurate field and goal kicking. They kicked 22 goals, 7. So, obviously if they'd kicked a bit more, normally, so to speak, it would have been not so much of an absolute belting, but more of a 10-11 goal thrashing. So, I don't know, mate, you can look at it from that perspective. They were very accurate goal kicking, and their defensive system just supports teammates. That's what allows May and Lever to do what they do best. The Melbourne system just allows them to come off their player when at the right time, and they're not making decisions such as who's going to kick a goal, but more like, how can I help out my teammates? And juxtaposing that against North Melbourne's forcing teammates to make kind of impossible decisions, it was quite obvious. I went to the game, unfortunately for me, and sat behind the goals as I like to do, and you could just see North Melbourne players finding it hard to make a good decision, defensively that is, whereas Melbourne just, covered each other's mistakes or covered each other's flaws, and that's why North Melbourne ended up with 7 goals for the game. But at one stage, we kicked the last 3 goals, sorry. So it could have easily been sort of 22 goals to 4 or 5. And again, 7's not much better, but it was looking worse than that at one point. That's the story of the game. Just done at quarter time, and we really didn't put up a whimper. So before I jump into the usual positive and negatives, just want to again encourage everyone to share me with any North Melbourne fans that you know. Subscribe to me on your chosen podcast service and give me a rating or a review. I'd really appreciate some more ratings, actually. Just helps with the surfacing of the podcast. And get involved. Follow me on Twitter at NorthPodShow. I've also got a Facebook and Instagram and a YouTube, but Twitter is certainly where I am more active. So just get involved and share me out. We will start with the negatives, as I like to do. was hard to narrow it down to just sort of 4 or 5 today, but I've tried to do that. And by the same token, it was hard to find 4 or 5 positives, but I did try my best. So I did toy in my head with a few different ideas around, maybe doing a different podcast format given it was such a bad game. But then I also considered how many more bad games there could be throughout the year. And I just thought, no, this is the format for now. Let's see how we go and what we can make of it. I certainly don't want this to be just complaining and being negative the whole time. I think I'm just going to try and keep it, here's what happened, kind of try and be as positive about it as I can and just look for those little nuggets of gold and what we can do about it in the short term and what that might look like in the long term. So the first negative, I think, definitely was Goldie being beaten the ruck quite thoroughly. And that doesn't happen often. There's certainly been plenty of games where he's kind of been a 50-50 contest, and obviously he's often won it. I mean, he's got the most hit-outs in the competition in history by a long way, so we know that generally he's quite a good ruckman. But I guess coming up against Gawn and Grundy is going to be a challenge. You don't really have any ruck contests where you're going in as clearly the best ruckman. So, yeah, I mean, Melbourne smashed us in the hit-outs 48-25. Goldie only had 19 for the match, so he was a bit down on the hit-outs. Coleman Jones and Common going down meant that Logue did a bit of rucky in that second half and kind of played, I guess, a bit of the role that we've seen Common play this year, played up forward a bit and in the ruck a little bit. And, look, he didn't look great in the ruck, but it's also not his job, and he wouldn't be doing that if we hadn't had those 2 injuries. The Melbourne ruckman just gave the Melbourne midfielders first use, and they often just walked out the front of stoppages with time to make a decision about where to kick it. So I think that's kind of the important thing that I wanted to touch on. Melbourne had more hit-outs to advantage. I didn't check the numbers on that, but I know that they had quite a few more hit-outs to advantage. And even though the clearances were quite even, like North Melbourne won the centre clearance battle by 1, it was 15-14, but Melbourne had 4 more stoppage clearances, 25-21. So it was pretty even. Melbourne only had 3 more clearances for the match, but the quality of clearances was quite stark. North Melbourne's clearances were quite often bombs to not even to a 50-50 contest, but like sort of kicking it long that and ended up being to the advantage of a Melbourne player, or it was a really short kick sideways that didn't give us an opportunity to sort of take advantage of that 6-6-6 if it was a centre clearance. On the other side, Melbourne would just get the ball, make a bit of a run, maybe give a quick handball, and then generally quite often had time to make a good decision about where to distribute the ball. And that's why they were so much more efficient inside 50. Which is nothing new for us North fans. We've consistently lost the efficiency inside 50 this year, so we're used to it. But yeah, the clearance numbers didn't tell the story for this match. It was really the clearance quality, which I thought was quite stark. And that part of that's Goldie getting thoroughly beaten, and part of that, I guess, is our midfield group as a whole. Bad thing or negative thing number 2 was just, and this is, I guess, a bit of a broad statement to make, but our running patterns were not intelligent. They weren't efficient. I always say no AFL football player goes out there and, makes a conscious effort not to try. It's just not something that they do. There's definitely levels of trying, don't get me wrong. And sometimes you think you're trying, but you're not. But there's also trying, and sometimes people call it trying too hard, but I just think it's trying without thought. And I think a lot of the running that North Melbourne was doing, like when they were putting in effort, it was just like, I know I need to get back now, but they didn't necessarily know what that looks like. There's a lot of players sort of trying to run backwards towards our defensive goal with their heads turned, like not really understanding where the ball was. And just, again, the difference or the contrast between that and what we saw from Melbourne is why we're down the bottom of the ladder and they're at the top, because they were so sure around their defensive structures. They communicated really well. From the top level, it's obviously hard to hear that, but you can see the surety in which the Melbourne players were moving. And by contrast, how unsure the North Melbourne players and defensive structures looked. And I mean, it just, you could see by midway through that first quarter, the heads were dropping. There was players being confused. There were, I guess, robust conversations going on between North Melbourne players after goals were kicked. And that's not necessarily a negative thing to, either challenge a player or challenge a teammate or, discuss something that's happened. But I think the issue is that it becomes a cultural issue when that's all you're doing, because you're not having enough of those successes or enough of those opportunities to be high-fiving and talking about something good that's happened. It's just always, you didn't make that decision, or why did you do that? And that's when the culture becomes negative. You don't have those opportunities to balance it out with positives. So that's a bit of a concern. I really, whilst I don't think it was a glaring issue for this game, it does worry me sort of long term. I thought the boys generally got around each other when mistakes were made and, gave the customary pat on the back. But it does, that concerned me a little bit in terms of the culture and the attitude and the mood of the players. -3 is a big one. The Comben injury looked really bad. It was just a bad game for injuries, really. We had three players that didn't take any further part in the match throughout. Obviously, Comben went down in the first quarter with what looked like to be quite a serious ankle or lower leg break. I've seen this morning that he has gone in for surgery, and so obviously it's going to be a while out for him. And he knew right away it was bad. We had Callum Coleman-Jones who came off with a knock. Not sure if that was a head related or just he was got a bit of a corky. It was a bit unclear. Tom Powell hurt his ankle late as well. So unfortunately, they're all the younger players that we want to be getting time into as well. So that's unfortunate. But Common definitely the worst of those injuries. And it's just another injury for a player that's been a bit injury prone. I saw a few people on social media saying he's not going to play again. And that seems quite extreme to me. I don't think we're at that point yet. But I do have concerns about his long-term durability, because some players are just prone to those kind of impact injuries, or, some players are just more injury prone than others. But he could come good. I mean, we obviously in the last sort of 10 years, we had Robbie Tarrant, who through his first, I don't know how many, 4, 5, 6 seasons, he really struggled to get in the park. He was having lots of shoulder reconstructions. And then obviously he did come good and was a pillar of our defence for 5, 6, 7 years. I'm not sure how long he was a pillar there, but he eventually came good with the injuries. And so that could happen. But obviously there's plenty of the alternative where players just aren't able to, play consistently, and as a result, aren't able to make it sort of to 50 or 100 games. So that's just a bit of a wait and watch with Comben. I suspect that he'll get back and play later in the year, but I do worry about his long-term prospects. Some players just have, the bodies for it. I mean, Boomer Harvey, I can remember him getting one, I think he broke his arm or his wrist or something like that, and he sort of missed 7 or 8 games, and that is about the only injury of note that I can remember him having. So some players have it and sometimes don't, and I guess that's how you end up playing 400 plus games. So anyway, it looks like Coleman Jones and Powell are just more minor injuries, but you never want to be coming out of a game with 3 injuries and one of them that bad. And yeah, I mean, it stopped the game for 5 or 6 minutes. It really looked like he was in a lot of pain. So hopefully Charlie's on the mend now and feeling a bit better. And all the best, Charles. Next negative. And this one, I think, is a bit... people will be waiting for this one, I think. It's one of those easy kills, but there were just too many passengers or actively poor players. And I think there's sort of 2 sides to that coin. There are either players not getting involved at all, or they were getting involved, but their impacts ended up being negative. So the first 2 easy ones, Kane Turner and Paul Curtis, both, they had 5 disposals each. Turner 0 tackles, Paul Curtis 1 tackle. Don't get me wrong, it was a hard game as a forward to get involved. The ball spent far more time in the Melbourne side of the game, but I mean, come on, 1 tackle between them, 10 touches between them. you've got to be getting more involved, pushing up the ground, putting pressure on. And sure, they did have pressure acts, and we'll talk a bit about pressure acts later on, but that's just not enough output, even if you're not kicking goals. You've got to be getting yourself more actively involved in the game. And obviously Kane Turner is the older player. He's far more in the spotlight than I think Paul Curtis is. He's absolutely welcome to have a bad game. We kind of embrace it almost because he's a young player and want to put the time in, but Kane Turner was useless. Tom Powell, it's harsh on him, but he only had 12 disposals, 11 of which were handballs. So 1 kick for the game and 1 tackle. And yes, he did get injured late, but he still spent 66% of the game on the ground. So, a midfielder of his ilk might, if they play out the game, sort of be on the field for 75 to 80% of the game time. So it wasn't a heap that he actually missed. And again, 12 disposals, 1 tackle. So just not involved enough. And the handballs, he's not the sort. I'd love to see him kicking the ball, I guess. To be having 11 handballs says to me that, he's in close and he's having a bit of an impact around the ball, but he's not spreading. He's not, I guess, launching those inside 50s or those passages from one halfback flank to the forward flank. So you'd love to see him getting involved more. But again, a younger player, and when we want, it's learning. Where it's not the case is Luke McDonald and Aaron Hall, and just horrific errors from them. Aaron Hall got plenty of the ball, so can't knock his ball-winning ability, and that's never been the knock on him. It's been around his effectiveness, and that was on show on Saturday night. He did have a couple of, effective possessions, but he had some howlers and some balls that just seemed to come off his shin. His kicking wasn't good. He looked far more, I guess, he read the play a lot better than he did in his first AFL game for the year against Gold Coast. But, you didn't really want it in his hand most of the time. And Luke McDonald, I'm going to call out, you've just got to have more awareness. Luke McDonald's our captain, and I think that he is a great choice culturally as captain. His form has fluctuated this year, and he had an absolute howler. Must have been the first quarter, or maybe the second quarter. He took a mark sort of in the goal square, defensive goal square, played on pretty quickly in absolutely no hurry, and then just got run down from a player that absolutely should have been in his peripheral vision. I think it was Neil Bullen, and it was just, you watched it and you went, how on earth could you not realise that you were under that much pressure? Ended up in a goal. Neil Bullen just put it through for an easy goal, and again, players can make mistakes, don't get me wrong. as a senior player at that point, as the captain, it's such a dejecting thing to happen, and so avoidable. He didn't get run down from behind. He would have known that Neil Bullen was in the vicinity, and I think he only knew that he was about to be tackled at the very last moment. But he was laconic. He didn't look like he was in a hurry at all, which I think is what made it so much worse. And finally, again, this is a bit harsh, but our other co-captain, Jai Simpkin, who, yes, came back from broken hand. So I think he tried his guts out. Don't get me wrong. I think he was absolutely giving his all. And I do think, he played with the glove on. I'm sure that his hand was impacting him a little bit. It could not be. But he had 11 turnovers. So it wasn't a good, efficient performance by him at all. His numbers were high enough, but 11 turnovers isn't going to cut it, unfortunately. So, and a lot of those, I honestly think, was him trying to do the right thing, trying to lower his eyes or get others involved, but that ended up in him sort of doing little dinky 20-metre kicks that quite often were turned over. So, that wasn't good enough from Jai, unfortunately, but he was giving it a red-hot crack. The final negative that I'm going to talk about, because I could go on, we were just still blazing away too often when we actually got it to that sort of 60 or 70 metres out from goal. I think players probably feel like they need to take responsibility, and they feel like they're taking it on for the right reasons, and I get it. And, the pressure and when you're in a rush, I think the default is I'm just going to kick it long. But they just kept missing. I reckon Larkey, who did kick 2 goals and was okay, but not amazing, He could have ended up with 4 or 5 if players had just lowered their eyes and kicked it to him in the pocket, or, had a look. I can think specifically of a time that Simpkin did it where he ran in, tried to kick it from 45 and kicked a point when he could have hit up Larky in the forward pocket 20 metres out, who was free. Like, he didn't have a player on him because the Melbourne defence had folded up to try and cover that. There's a couple other times that similar things like that happen. So it's just, I think it is around playing in a poor team. Mentally, you think, all right, I've got to take the responsibility here. I'm going to kick the goal. And yeah, I don't know, I said to my partner who I was watching the game with, like, we're going to miss this. And we invariably did. And maybe that's just being part of following a consistently bad side over the past few years. You're conditioned to think that the players are going to stuff it up. But yeah, we really need to work on that assurity when we're 60 or 70 out, and we're looking for those players on a lead that we can hit them at, say, 30 or 40 metres from goal, rather than kicking it right to the goal square, or, as I said, blazing away and kicking a point when we would have loved a goal. But that's enough of the negatives. Let's try and go through a couple of positives. I do have a few. I did have to think long and hard, but I came up with a couple. So I thought these senior players, well, most of them are senior players, flew the flag. I thought Zeeble, Cunnington, Sheasel, who's obviously not a senior player, who's playing his 7th game, Zerha and Shields gave it a crack and either played solid or played a good game. Zerha had 3 goals, and when he was going through the middle, I thought he looked good. It was almost, it certainly wasn't. No, it wasn't a perfect game, but he played a good game in a side that got belted by 90 points. I thought. It's always, you can never fault his aggression. I thought his aggression looked good in the middle, and as I said, kicked 3, could have kicked 4 or 5 if he'd been a little bit more efficient. Took a great grab in the goal square to kick our only goal for the first quarter. So I thought Zerha was good. Zeeble was pretty solid in defence, got enough of the ball, looked relatively confident and disposed of it relatively well. So I thought he marshalled the troops pretty well. Cunnington was more effective through the middle than he'd been in recent weeks. I thought it was another good game from him. His clearance work and his composure. He didn't get caught sort of holding the ball or in awkward positions as much as he has in the past couple of weeks. So yeah, I thought Cunners was good. Sheasel, to be honest, looked like our cleanest and most confident player, which is great for us, but the fact that the 7-gamer is coming across that way is obviously a concern for us. He was back to sort of what he'd been doing the first few rounds, had plenty of the ball, disposed of it well, and just made those quick, good decisions, which is what you want those elite players to be doing. I think Sheasel's definitely got potential to be an elite player in the future. And finally, Shields, he was a little sloppy at times. He did turn it over a bit, but he led the team for pressure acts with 36, which was 10 more than any other player on the ground. Simpkin was next best, he had 26. So Shields really led the pressure, and he also led the team for tackles, had 6 tackles. So that's why we've got him across or out of retirement. He's not an elite player or anything, but he does what he does well. So it was good to see him. I was a bit iffy on him coming across, but I think it's been great to have a senior player with some consistency like Shields. And I do think, I stand by the fact that I think it's him or Hall. Totally granted, they're different players, but I think in terms of their age demographic and what they bring to the side at the moment, I'd prefer to see Shields in and Hall out, particularly given what Hall gave us on the weekend. The second positive, Core and Mackay were a little better, and this is where I'm putting my positive hat on. I wouldn't say that they were fantastic at all. Obviously, they conceded 90. Well, they were part of a defence that conceded 90 points. But if we're looking for positives, I thought Mackay read the ball a bit better than he has in recent weeks. Was able to get across and intercept a couple of times, and didn't get caught making as many poor decisions, I guess. And Core was able to spoil a bit more. He didn't get beaten in those one-on-one contests like he has the past couple of weeks as much. Yeah, he was able to spoil, make a contest, bring the ball to ground a couple of times, and that is an improvement from where he's been. I'm still not sure that I want him in the team at the moment. We might talk about that soon, but yeah, I did think that he was improvement, and I mean, yeah, it's coming from a low bar, but it was good to see those individually, those defenders were a little bit improved. Another positive, I guess, was we were able to kick those last 3 goals to ensure it wasn't a 100-point drubbing. So I mentioned that earlier on. I just think not having that 100-point defeat is a bit of a mental, all right, well, we didn't get smashed by 100 points. It actually doesn't mean anything functionally, but I think mentally it gives you a bit, or rather it's not as bad as that 100-point margin would be. Yeah, again, this is where I had to really scrape the bottom of the barrel for those positives. I think Cunner's kicking that goal on the final siren was a real positive for him and for the team, and the spirit, I guess, because I think it's fair to say that Cunnington is our spiritual leader in terms of the way that he's a leader by example, and having him have a good game and end it on a goal was good. But yeah, that's really all there is to it. When it was 100 points, I was much more comfortable with it being that 90-point margin than 100, and that is saying something. And the final positive was, that final siren. That was fantastic. The game was over, and the embarrassing, abysmal, horrific match was finally complete, so I was able to leave. So that was a positive for me, and I know you can leave early. I don't like to leave early. I don't like to turn the TV off early. I think you've got to watch it all and kind of, you got to take the good with the bad, I guess, and that we've just been taking a lot of bad recently. I thought the food at the MCG was nice, had a bit of variety. Obviously, North Melbourne usually is playing at Marvel if we're in Melbourne, and I hadn't been to the G in a couple of years, actually, for a football match, which didn't occur to me until I sort of was walking in, just with the COVID years, and just didn't manage to get to a game at the G last year for North Melbourne. So it had been a couple of years. And yeah, I thought there was some interesting food options. A bit more variety than Marvel. There's a few more, I guess, different options to buy food. I only got a burger and chips for what it's worth if you're playing along at home. But yeah, that was positive. So that's where I couldn't think of a fourth positive to come out of the match. So I went with the final siren and the food. And being back at the G, although it was a thumping, I'm sure it will be a good experience for some of those young players to play a relatively prime time Saturday night game at the G. And it was a great night in terms of, it was a perfect night for footy, which is probably why Melbourne was able to absolutely belt us. So we'll move into, I guess, the news from the past week or so. And there hasn't been a heap. I did catch up with Clarko's press conference middle of last week, and he was just talking about sort of that tipping point where it's probably not worth playing the senior players, because if you're going to get belted, you may as well get belted with the young kids, which I thought was, a bit of an interesting foreshadowing with what happened on the weekend. And he sort of alluded to that in his post-game presser, that potentially that tipping point is right here, and it is maybe time to go all in on the kids. So I just thought that was an interesting comment in the press conference. I think that was in response to a lot of people sort of saying, well, why are we playing Hall? Why are we playing Shields? Why are we playing Aiden Core as an example? Or these Daniel Howe, Kane Turner, these more senior players that aren't performing, like what's the point, I guess? So I think when the teams come out this Thursday, we won't get our official team till Friday, but when the teams come out later in the week, I think it's going to be interesting to see sort of how Clarko's thinking has changed as a result of getting belted. I thought also it was interesting just looking at his comments around maybe Larky shouldn't have played against Brisbane because he was carrying that injury, and it's so frustrating. I understand why teams don't want to publicly come out or publicly say how injured someone is, because it kind of gives the opposition information. But as fans, it is frustrating. Well, I was more frustrated with the other fans for, hanging it on Larky, because it was so clear that he was hampered by injury. So it was interesting that Clarko has finally come out and actually made some comments around the fact that Larky was injured, and that, that was pretty obvious if you ask me. It looks like he's maybe mostly back to fitness. He was still getting pushed out of a few of those contests on the weekend, but he did look a lot better given the lack of ball that he got. So I just think that's worth remembering sometimes is we don't get the full story, and it's not because the club doesn't respect us, it's because giving up that information to the opposition is not what they want to be doing. So I thought that was an interesting comment. And the only other thing, I guess, was that there wasn't a VFL game as such. The North Melbourne team had a bye, so they only had match simulation. Wardlaw still managed to pick up a bit of a knee knock in that game, which is fantastic. It sounds like it was just a bit of a bruise, but again, even so, you don't want young players getting injured in scratch matches. But I just thought that sort of makes it hard for us to predict who might come back in because they haven't really played a match. Match sim is not the same. I think I played short players, might have played Sandringham, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure what they're going to do in terms of ins and outs, but that's, I guess, what we're about to talk about. So we've got the Saints at Marvel on Sunday twilight. It's my least favourite time slot. I hate it, but we probably deserve it this year, so I'll take it, I suppose. Another big test, unfortunately, for us, or fortunately, depending on how you see it. Saints are coming off that disappointing loss to Port Adelaide, where they got out to a bit of a lead in that first quarter and then kind of struggled to score after quarter time. So, you know, I'm sure there's something in that. They'll be looking to prove that. I mean, really, I think most good teams are going to come up against North at the moment and go, we have to prove that we're a good team, so we need to smash these lowly North Melbourne, West Coast, Hawthorn sides, I think. That's really what teams' motivation is going to be coming in with. So that's what I'm expecting. Obviously, Saints on paper they don't have an amazing list, but they do have a really good coach. That's a position that we kind of find ourselves in, although I think our list is worse than theirs, obviously. So at least you look at this and you go, look, Melbourne, the talent gap was significant. I think the talent gap is smaller with the Saints, but obviously, I mean, they're playing extremely well. Ross Lyon's got them playing some great footy, and if we know anything about Ross, he's great at getting the most out of players. I mean, Zach Dawson, he got the most out of him at two different clubs. Mason Wood, North Melbourne supporters would know that he was at best an inconsistent player for us, and yeah, I mean, he played his 100th on the weekend and has been playing some great footy on the wing for the Saints, and he was one of those ones we delisted at the end of 2020. So yeah, look, it should be an interesting game. Interesting from the perspective of how much will we lose by is really how I feel about it. But I'm going to go in positive and try and stay the course because I'm not about club bashing. In terms of who's coming in and going out, I mean, who knows? The no scratch match, it's really hard to know where Clarko's head's at and where the match committee is thinking. But I mean, Turner, Howe and Hall have to be on thin ice. They just have to be, based on the way that they've been playing and their age profile. Hall in particular, I get he deserved a chance from the VFL, but he hasn't delivered, and I just think we don't need to be giving those senior players extended runs in the AFL. If they're not up to it, they're not up to it. Obviously, Common's going to be out. Common Jones has to be doubtful. Powell's pretty doubtful. So those three looks like will probably come out at least for a week, and Common for much longer. So I think replacing Powell appears to be pretty straightforward. Like Phillips comes back in, one would think. I think I'm okay with him kind of having a rest every now and then because his consistency isn't there at the moment. But let's get him back in with Powell possibly coming out. I think Lazaro and or Marnie deserve a look. Obviously, Marnie is a forward and Lazaro is more of a wing or a high half forward. So, you know, I'd be looking at them kind of replacing a Turner and a Howe respectively. I don't think either of them are going to be the solution. I don't expect either of them to play exceptionally well, but I just think we have to get the young players in so we can have a look. I think Bergman, well, it's Bergman or Goda for that kind of halfback Aaron Hall role, but Goda's still got the hamstring at the moment, so I think it has to be Bergman in for a couple of games. And he played well early in the year before he was unwell, so I'd like to see him come back in for Hall. Drury could also be worth a go, but he's pretty raw if we're looking for that kind of midfielder to half forward I know there's been plenty of talk online of people wanting him in, and I think he'll get his opportunity at some stage. I'm not sure if it will be right away, but again, with these injuries, you never know. It's really hard to know what they're going to do with the tools, because with Coleman Jones injured and Comben injured and Cherry still injured, I haven't heard any word about him being back as yet, so it could be a couple more weeks for him. That's it for our forwards. So it's Free, who's a very raw ruckman, albeit I think he might be 24. So he's played some waffle, but certainly didn't look like he was ready for AFL level based on what we've seen. And Jacob Edwards, who is still very raw. So I don't know. I mean, Goldie can be the number one ruck, and I guess a Larkey potentially, or maybe Griffin Logue again could do the small bits of rucking that's required at other times. But the forward line's going to need some work. Maybe Zerhard does need to spend most of his time there. I'm not sure. It's going to be interesting to see, particularly if Coleman Jones is actually injured for a couple of weeks, what Clarko does there. And let's be honest, we have to be realistic. It's pretty rare that teams make heaps of changes in one go. I've seen so many over the past couple of weeks, so many predictions about, with people saying there's going to be these 6 players must be out and these 6 players must be in. I really think, unless you've had a lot of injuries, having 6 in and out in one go is pretty unusual. I could definitely see sort of 4 or 5 being in and out this week, depending on how many of those injuries stick around. But yeah, that many would surprise me. Whoever does get picked, we're just looking for them to have a crack. I tweeted before the Melbourne game asking sort of what people were looking for, and the overwhelming sentiment was that people just want the team to have a crack, and I couldn't agree more. I just want them to go out there and look like there's some semblance of game plan, and if we get beaten by a team with more skills, then that's fine. We can cop that. When we just look listless and defeated, I'm not here for that. We need more from that. In this being what our 4th year of being a terrible team, we need to start seeing more effort, I think. So yeah, I don't even want to make a prediction about the team at this stage. The team will be what it will be, but let's hope for more effort from the team. Let's hope for a couple more of those younger players, as opposed to those older players that aren't going to send us anywhere in the next sort of 4 years. That's it for the podcast, I guess. Sorry for probably being a bit negative. I did try my best to be balanced, but it's hard to be positive after a 90-point belting. It really is. So thanks for listening to the negativity all this way. I hope that you've gotten something out of it, and we can come away and try and go into the game against the Saints feeling somewhat positive. Yeah, remember to subscribe, rate, review the podcast. And yeah, I guess we'll chat next week after the Saints game. Go North.